At the end of June 1940, only days after the first Yagumo was started, Japan began another class of destroyer. These were the 12 ships, with several more canceled, of the 2,701-ton Akizuki Class. These were the destroyers Japan needed, just not in the numbers needed. They were Japan's heaviest destroyers. Yes, even heavier than the cartoonishly freaky Shimakaze. But it was a good investment. The actual employment of them, The design started as an anti-aircraft light cruiser, somewhat equivalent to the Atlanta or Dido class. Dwindling resources, time, money, etc., though, meant they were scaled back. Not a problem, though, as the idea here was for a class of anti-aircraft escort. One can only imagine a Japanese carrier task force, let's say 6 carriers, with decent radar, full decks of decently trained pilots, the 2 Tones sending scout planes to all corners of the map, and 8 of these guys circling the force. Also throw in some good medium and light anti-aircraft with decent fire control. Now that would have been impressive. Wait, what am I saying? I'm an American. That would have been a nightmare. Thank you, Imperial Japan, for wasting men, material, and time on deviant art aircraft carrier submarines, ill-suited destroyers, Frankenstein battleship carriers, and floating hotels with 18-inch guns, all armed with Buster Keatonish light and medium anti-aircraft. The main attraction of these ships was their guns. These were new 100mm 65 caliber guns. They were somewhat light for dual-purpose guns, but considering their high rate of fire, the average height and weight of a gunner, and that their primary purpose was anti-aircraft, that was not just acceptable but totally justifiable. Torpedo armament was also, in retrospect, okay-ish. Originally, they were to carry no torpedoes at all. Probably would have been a good idea. But then someone insisted they should carry some just in case. So they got a single quadruple mount with reloads. So again, great idea, not enough of them, trickled into service, and came too late. Akizuki was started June 30th, 1940, and was completed June 11th, 1942. Teruzuki was started November 13th, 1940, and was completed August 31st, 1942. Suzutsuki was started March 15th, 1941, and was completed December 29th, 1942. Hatsuzuki was started July 25th, 1941, and was completed December 29th, 1942. Mizuki was started December 8th, 1941, and was completed March 31st, 1943. Wakatsuki was started March 9th, 1942, and was completed May 31st, 1943. Shimotsuki was started July 6th, 1942, and was completed March 31st, 1944. Fuyutsuki was started May 8th, 1943, and was completed May 25th, 1944. Harutsuki was started December 23rd, 1943, and was completed December 28th, 1944. Oyozuki was started August 25th, 1943, and was completed January 31st, 1945. Hanazuki was started February 10th, 1944, and was completed December 26th, 1944. Natsuzuki was started May 1st, 1944, and was completed April 8th, 1945. Main armament was 8 100mm 65 caliber dual-purpose guns in 4 twin mounts, all on the center line, with 2 forward and 2 aft. Again, these were pretty good guns. Each mount weighed 34,500 kilograms. Maximum elevation was 90 degrees. Elevation speed was 16 degrees per second, and crucially, they could be loaded at any angle. Training speed was about 14 degrees per second. Recoil was 490 millimeters, which cocked for the next shot. Fuse setting was done by a machine that the shells were put in. This obviously wasn't in the league of the US's proximity fuse, but for the time was still pretty standard. Sustained rate of fire was about 15 rounds per minute, even at high angles. 200 rounds per gun were carried. Muzzle velocity was 1,000 meters per second. The one-piece rounds were 28 kilograms with a .95 kilogram bursting charge. Maximum surface range was 19,500 meters. Maximum anti-aircraft range was 11,000 meters up to 13,000 meters. Again, their only real weakness was lack of superlative fire control on par with the U.S.'s Mark 37, but realistically, an electromechanical radar-guided computer was technologically beyond them. So, torpedo armament was one armored quad mount on the center line at main deck level behind the funnel for the 610 millimeter Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. Reloads for the mount was built into the rear superstructure. Initially 56, but later up to 72 depth charges were carried, along with 6 depth charge launchers, and they had the Type 93 sonar. Later ships were completed with Types 22, 21, and 13 radar, while the earlier ones were fitted with them in 1943. Propulsion was provided by 3 boilers, 2 venting to the forward funnel and 1 venting to the aft funnel. The funnels trunked together on the deck, just like on cruisers, to reduce their footprint on deck. These provided steam to the 2 turbines, which produced 52,000 horsepower, each driving one of the 2 propellers. This gave them a maximum speed of 33 knots. They had 1 rudder. Upon completion in mid-June 1942, Akizuki spent the rest of the month escorting Zuikaku to the Aleutians in case the USN tried to recapture them after the Battle of Midway. At the start of the third quarter, she escorted the carriers to the Solomons and protected them at the Battle of Eastern Solomons before returning to Truk. In mid-October 1942, she escorted the convoy that delivered to Guadalcanal simultaneous to the Battle of Cape Esperance. Near the end of the month, she escorted the convoy that sailed for Guadalcanal but was aborted following the Battle of Santa Cruz, being damaged in the process. At the beginning of November, she returned to Japan and spent the rest of the year there in repair. January 1943 found Akizuki back at Truk escorting convoys. In the evening of January 19th, 1943, she was damaged by a torpedo from Nautilus. The damage was severe, with engine rooms flooding and the keel strained. Limping back to Japan, repairs and training would take until November 1943. She returned to Truk at the start of December 1943 and operated out of there until February 1944, when the whole fleet transferred to the East Indies. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, she escorted the carriers and returned with them to Japan afterward. She was escorting the carriers at the Battle of Cape Engano on the morning of October 25, 1944, when at 8:40 a.m. she was attacked. Hit by carrier aircraft, she blew up and sank. Teruzuki arrived at Truk in mid-October 1942 after completion and escorted the carriers at the Battle of Santa Cruz. The next month, she took part in both battles of Guadalcanal, assisting in the abandoning of first Hiei and then Kirishima. The next month, on December 11th, she was protecting an overnight Tokyo Express unload when she was attacked by 2 PT boats. The fires eventually reached her depth charges, putting an end to her 2-month career. Suzutsuki entered service in late December 1942 and promptly spent all of 1943 escorting ships around the Central Pacific. On January 15, 1944, she left Japan on a supply run to Wake and promptly had her bow and stern blown off by the submarine Sturgeon, being towed back to port. With repairs completed in mid-October 1944, she left Japan again, escorting a convoy, and promptly again got part of her bow blown off by the submarine Besuga, back to dock. With repairs completed in mid-November 1944, she escorted the carrier Junyo to Manila and back for the rest of the month. With fuel and air cover scarce, Suzuki's final mission was escorting Yamato in Operation Tengo, On April 7th at 1 p.m., she took a bomb that wrecked her, you guessed it, bow. Limping back to port, she was essentially written off as unrepairable, given the war situation, and used as a floating anti-aircraft platform. Post-war, she was sunk as a breakwater. Hatsuzuki joined the fleet in mid-January 1943 and spent the rest of the year and the start of 1944 escorting ships around the Central Pacific. In February 1944, she sailed to the East Indies. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, she escorted the carriers and returned with them to Japan afterward. At the Battle of Cape Engano, she was with the carriers when they were sunk, and as she was rescuing survivors, the American cruisers and destroyers cleanup force sank her. Nizuki entered service at the beginning of April 1943. In mid-June, she headed to the Solomons. At the July 5th, 6th Battle of Kula Gulf, she was sunk while escorting the troop transports. Wakatsuki entered service at the start of June 1943 and almost immediately helped rescue survivors from the Mutsu. In mid-August 1943, she sailed to Truk to help in the Solomons. At the start of November, she took part in the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, then survived the U.S. carrier raid on Rabaul, following by a return to Japan. In February 1944, she transferred to the East Indies, then escorted the carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, then returned to Japan. Next, she escorted the carriers at the Battle of Cape Engano, returning to Japan afterwards. Finally, for her came the Battle of Ormoc Bay, where she was attacked by carrier aircraft and sunk. Shimotsuki entered service at the end of March 1944. At the start of June 1944, she sailed to the East Indies and joined the fleet for the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where she escorted the carriers, returning to Japan with them afterward. At the Battle of Cape Engano, she escorted the carriers and, for her trouble, took a near miss that ripped a hole in her port quarter. After repairs in mid-November, she escorted a transport run to and from the East Indies. At 4:48 a.m. on November 25th, while returning from Singapore, she was hit by 4 torpedoes from the submarine Cavella, blew up, jackknifed, and sunk. Fuyuzuki entered service in June 1944, but was too late to take part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. While sailing through the Inland Sea on October 12, 1944, she was torpedoed by the submarine Trepang that damaged her forward. Repairs took nearly a month and a half. On January 30th, 1945, she grounded and had to go back in for repairs. Her only real action was escorting the Yamato when she sailed for Okinawa. For her efforts, she was strafed and rocketed. Afterward, with little fuel or air cover, like the rest of the fleet, she was essentially downgraded to a training and floating anti-aircraft platform. On the late day of August 20th, 1945, she hit a mine that blew her stern off. Along with the rest of the scrap fleet, she was handed over unrepaired at the end of the war and sunk as a breakwater. Hanazuki entered service in late December 1944, but, again, with little fuel or air cover, she basically couldn't do much for what was left of the war. Post-war, she was briefly commissioned into the U.S. for experimentation before being sunk as a target in 1948. Haruzuki entered service also at the end of December 1944 and also didn't do much for the rest of the war. Post-war, she was ceded to the Soviets. Oyuzuki entered service at the end of January 1945 and also didn't do much for the rest of the war, short of being a harbor anti-aircraft platform. Post-war, she was ceded to the Chinese. Natsuzuki entered service at the beginning of April 1945. In mid-June, she hit a mine, heavily damaging her. Post-war, she was turned over to the British, who quickly scrapped her.